Alright, so now that we have our Xbox 360 set up and ready for game deployment, let's go ahead and turn our attention back to Space Fighter. Now at the moment, Space Fighter has been designed as a Windows XNA game. The goal is to get Space Fighter over onto the Xbox 360, but we don't want to simply make a new Xbox 360 game and copy all of our code, all of our classes over into that game, and then deploy. Why not? Well, if you think about it, at that point, we'll have two code bases for Space Fighter, one that's a Windows game and one that's an Xbox 360 game. Why is that bad? Well, what if I was working in the Windows game because, maybe only once a day or once every couple of days I deploy over to the Xbox 360 to make sure that everything's looking and working fine. But for the most part, I'm working inside of Windows with a Windows game. So let's say I'm doing that, and I make a bunch of changes to Space Fighter. Now I need for those changes to be available over on the Xbox 360. What am I going to have to do? Well, I would have to visit the Xbox 360 Space Fighter version and make all of the same changes. Well, as everyone knows, after spending hours coding, there's changes all over the place. It can become quite a headache to keep track of all of these changes and then to jump over to another project and sync things up. So, in this video, we're going to demonstrate how we can set Space Fighter up in such a way that we more or less have two projects to work with, a Windows one and an Xbox 360 one, but they're sharing the same code base. That way, we can work in Windows all day long, we can make changes, we can add new stuff into it, but when we deploy over to the Xbox 360 after loading up the Xbox 360 project, everything deploys just fine with all of the new changes that we've made. This is a very convenient way to develop, and it just makes sense. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. By the end of the video, we should see Space Fighter running just fine in both Windows and over on the Xbox 360.
All right, let's get started. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the things that we're going to need to accomplish in order to set up this dual solution scenario. What we'll be doing is we'll make a temporary Xbox 360 solution just to gain a new solution file and new project file. We'll then take those two files, just the solution and the project, and we'll transplant those back into our existing Space Fighter folder structure. After that, we'll need to make a small change to the solution file in an external text editor in order to point it at the correct folder. Once this is done, we'll be able to load up our solution under the current code base and simply add all of the classes in, build, and we'll be finished. So let's take a look at each of those steps. Let's begin in Visual Studio, and we'll start with a new Xbox 360 game. The name here is actually relevant because once you get the solution put together, you do want this to make sense, since this is going to be the actual name of the Xbox 360 solution file. So I'm going to call this Space Fighter 360, just to set it apart from the existing Space Fighter solution. We'll hit OK to the solution, and then we'll simply close it out. That's the only thing we wanted to do with it, was just to establish the solution itself. If we look at our projects folder, you'll note that this has created the expected folder structure. We have a Space Fighter 360 folder. If we jump into that, we see a solution file, followed by another folder named Space Fighter 360. Inside that folder, we see a project file for our current solution. And it is these two files that we'll need to move back to our current project. Everything else has been left default from a new game. So let's begin with the project file. We'll jump up a few levels, and I'll just jump back and forth because I have only one window to work with here. So we're jumping out of the Space Fighter 360 folder into the original Space Fighter folder, into the subfolder, and pasting this in place. So the folder structure we should have here is a Space Fighter CS proj file and a Space Fighter 360 CS proj file. Now we'll jump back up a few levels, back into the Space Fighter 360 project, so that we can grab the Space Fighter 360 solution, and we'll paste that in our original Space Fighter folder. Now, the thing that we're going to need to edit is the fact that this solution for the 360 is expecting this folder to be named Space Fighter 360. We need to change that over to just Space Fighter in order to have it work with everything that is currently part of Space Fighter. In order to do this, we'll need to load the solution into an external text editor. Notepad would work just fine. In our case, we already have context loaded up in the background, so we'll simply leverage it. The line we're looking for is about 3 or 4 lines down, and we're looking for the line that defines the project itself. Over to the right, we can see a series of text that denotes the folder structure that it will be looking for. This is actually a relative path pointing to the project file, and it's currently looking for that project file in a folder named Spacefighter 360. Since we've moved these files around, it should now be looking in the folder that's simply called Spacefighter. So we'll simply remove the 360 from that portion, being careful not to remove Spacefighter 360 from the first quoted text, or from the project file, or from anywhere else in the solution file. We're only looking for that as part of the folder in the project path. With this change in place, we'll hit Save on the solution. Then we can go back into Visual Studio. We'll go to Open. We'll go into Spacefighter, but we'll load the Spacefighter 360 solution. We'll hit Open to the solution, and you'll note that we're still missing a series of folders, but let's look what has already come along. If we look at the game class and open it up, notice the fact that all of our Spacefighter code is in place. Here's where we're setting up the star field and loading textures. We've got our custom draw that is drawing nodes and drawing certain bars on the screen. The reason this has already been updated is the 360 version of the solution was looking for a class named Game 1, and our original Spacefighter was looking for a class named Game 1. So this simply came along for the ride. And if we look into content, it has already enumerated all of the files in the content subproject, so we already have all of our assets in place, all of the textures and the sprite font. The final piece that we need to put into place are all of the classes. Unfortunately for us, all of those have been organized into subfolders. So in order to make the 360 project aware of those classes, all we need to do is to go down to the Spacefighter folder and simply drag the background, the engine, and the game folders into the 360 solution. If we drop those in place, we have all of these classes. So I'm going to collapse these down just to save on space. And there should be only one final place that we need to make an edit. Inside of all of our Spacefighter setups, we've always had the namespace just being set to Spacefighter. If we look at the overall program, this program coming along with the solution for Spacefighter 360, we'll note that even in here, we've already got the new Spacefighter. Why is this? Well, once again, we didn't move a project file over. This came along with the original Spacefighter. So just noting that all of the namespaces match up because all of the code files are now coming from the original Spacefighter. The only things that we copied were the solution that is describing the project and the project itself. Now that we have all of the Spacefighter code and assets set up as an Xbox 360 project, we should be able to deploy and check this out on the 360. So we'll hit Build and Deploy. The build has started. The deployment has started. We'll switch over to the 360 and note the fact that we can actually watch it transfer the individual assets over to the 360. Once it has finished all of the transfer, we now have Spacefighter playable on an Xbox 360.
Very, very nice.
So overall, considering the fact that we have already set up a scenario for sharing the code bases between the Windows and Xbox 360 version, that is really a relatively painful process. Considering that just due to the nature of Spacefighter and the techniques used for coding it, there were no actual code changes.
Did you say it was a painful process?
I said I meant unpainful. Maybe it was
a painless process. And I agreed with you. I was like, wait a minute. No, that wasn't painful at all.
Having to press buttons, that'll get to you.
Now, proving that we can make changes, and those changes will reflect over in the other version, if you will, Windows versus Xbox 360. Let's see if we can do that.
Okay. Let's make a change that would be very visually noticeable. And you'll notice that I closed the capture software and not the game itself. If we're looking at Visual Studio here, we see it's still running. Let's close that out and let me regain my capture solution so that I can watch what's going on in 360. Since I've exited Visual Studio, we're awaiting a connection. Now let's make a change that is easily noticeable. Let's go to the background color for the overall game, and let's change it to some other color. Maybe, I don't know, slate gray.
That'll be noticeable.
If we redeploy and give the 360 just a moment to load up, yes, now we have a very bright background, and we've suddenly made the star effect look like soot. But again, very noticeable difference. If we stop the solution now and switch over to the Windows version, meaning if we go in, close the current solution, open up Spacefighter, the original solution, and hit F5 to run, the game rebuilds for the PC, given This might be an interesting issue to show on screen. We have tweaked certain things on the machine to make sure that we can capture using the capture device to view on the Xbox. Give us just a moment as we switch videos, and we'll show this running. We'll be back after a quick screen flip.
All right, so that was just a quick splice there. Let's go ahead and explain exactly what happened. While recording these VTMs, jumping back and forth between a capture generally poses a problem without turning off hardware acceleration for your video card. We had hardware acceleration turned off for all of the capturing that we were doing with the Xbox 360, but then jumping back over here into Visual Studio and trying to compile and run our Windows-based game made everything very unhappy. It wanted the hardware acceleration re-enabled. And so we simply shut everything down for a second, re-enabled hardware acceleration, and then began recording again. So we're exactly where we left off 2 seconds ago.
And the point that we had left off at was running our changes. We were inside of the Xbox 360 version of our Spacefighter solution. We had made a change that caused the background to be lighter, and we were building inside of Windows to see if that change would carry over. So here we are once again. Let's build and run with hardware acceleration enabled. And we can see that we have our Windows Spacefighter running with the brightened background.
Yeah, this is Windows. Look at the title bar. It says Spacefighter. We're not in virtual dub, in a capture mode.
And if I close the game, we immediately dump back to Visual Studio, as opposed to the capture device that was...
So change it to another color.
Let's go down to the Game 1 class for Spacefighter. On the PC version, scroll down to the very bottom.
Some sort of crazy red background or something.
All right, color.red.
Yeah, that'll be crazy.
What does that result in? Oh, yeah, that's I would say that's noticeable.
So let's go ahead and make sure that this is saved, and let's reopen the solution for the Xbox 360 and deploy it once again.
All right, let's switch back over. Let's close the Windows solution, open the 360 solution, and run the game. So we'll deploy, switch over to our capture device, and the Xbox 360 will pick up the changes, and here we are on the Xbox with the new red background. So again, very convenient because whatever you adjust in either solution is all carried over because it's shared in the same code base.
And something else I'd like to point out, while you're working with an Xbox 360 game inside of Visual Studio, you can set breakpoints just like normal. Use them as if, well, you were working with a Windows build.
As a matter of fact, if we leave Spacefighter running at the moment and switch back over to Visual Studio, you can see that the solution is indeed running. And what would happen if we were to simply, inside of the draw method, drop down a breakpoint? Well, we would immediately hit it because we're running this method very frequently.
So let's take a look at our game.
Our game is now frozen, and has frozen at this point, and we're free to step through things, take a look at locals, or do whatever is needed to be done to debug our game. And if we wish to continue running, we can simply hit F5. Well, if we clear the breakpoint, we can hit F5, and we see that on the 360, gameplay resumes as normal.
Very nice.
I'll also point out the fact that if you hit an exception, you'll be able to view that inside of Visual Studio. For example, if I were to go into the game folder and load up Spacefighter's configuration and change any of the sprite sheet texture assets to something that is invalid, for example, let's take asteroid and throw a bunch of additional letter A's, so that is certainly a graphic we don't have set up. If we attempt to deploy and then watch the game attempt to run on the 360, we'll notice in the background Visual Studio has stopped, and we see that there is an unhandled exception inside of the load content. As a matter of fact, that it was error loading the AAA asteroid file. If we break on that point, we can see that inside of Visual Studio, it was actually the load content method inside of the sprite sheet that raised the exception. So again, very helpful for tracing through what problems may be, as in Visual Studio's behavior will generally be very familiar to what you're used to when developing on Windows. So we'll stop this back out. We will go into configuration, make sure we correct that example problem, redeploy, switch back over to our Xbox screen for one final time, and show that while we're still using the debug red color, Spacefighter is indeed working. So with that, that is Spacefighter all set up and running on the Xbox 360. We've taken a look at a more interesting setup for our two solutions, for the Windows solution and for the 360 solution, such that they can share the same code base. And we've taken a look at a bit of working with an actual XNA 360 game from Visual Studio.
Excellent. And with that, that will wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.